Good evening, y'all. My name is Kenzie New-Walker, and I work as the executive director for the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, a grassroots institution that educates and preserves a people's history of the mine wars. I am back once again to welcome y'all to our 6th episode of Mine Wars Forum Season 3. We launched this project or program way back when in 2020 at the onset of the pandemic as a way to keep this history alive in a public forum. And we're proud to keep this programming going 3 seasons later. This year's season of Mine Wars Forum has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight, I am really excited to welcome Dr. Rachel Donaldson to the forum. Rachel Donaldson is a historian and historic preservationist whose work focuses on cultural and labor history. She's written 2 books on the history of folk music revival and national identity. I Hear America Singing, Folk Music and National Identity and Roots of the Revival, American and British Folk Music in the 1950s, co-authored with Ronald D. Cohen. Her current work focuses on adapting a place-based approach to labor history. She works as an independent contractor for the National Historic Landmarks Program of the National Park Service, and she has revised and edited the Labor History Theme Study and co-authored an NHL nomination for the Jefferson County Courthouse for its association with the legal aftermath of the West Virginia Mine Wars. She's currently writing a National Historic Landmarks nomination for the Charleston Cigar Factory in Charleston, South Carolina. Welcome, Dr. Donaldson. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So this year marks the 100th anniversary of the Treason Trials, but before we get into that, I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the other work that you've done. So you wrote a book titled I Hear America Singing, and you co-authored another book titled Roots of the Revival, Folk Music in the United States and Great Britain in the 1950s. Can you talk a little bit about your research on folk music and what inspired you about it?
Sure. So I originally went to grad school to be a labor historian, which I have veered back into. I took a little detour when writing my dissertation because I was very interested in kind of the culture of labor history and in looking at the researching the music of like the labor activism. I read a lot about Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and the Almanac Singers and Pete Seeger's desire to create a singing labor movement. So that's kind of why the detour led into my dissertation in my first book about the kind of the political underpinnings of the folk music revival. So it's when people were trying to get this music out there. I mean, and it's kind of a misnomer to say that it's a revival because they weren't reviving the music. The music was alive and well. What what they were trying to revive was, people's interest in it. And their desire to preserve it themselves by singing it and performing music and the like. So I was looking kind of what's their underlying mission in getting this music out there and how they used it to promote labor activism, civil rights activism, and the like, and how they really tried to create this democratic notion of Americanism and saying like this is our national civic heritage. Our culture is rooted in this kind of these democratic principles that are revealed in the nation's folk music. So I traced that how they did that from the 1930s to the 1970s.
Super cool. For the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial, we actually kicked off with music, particularly with labor music, and so we got to hear how some of those traditions were carried on, not only, to lift up like the spirits of folks during these actions, but also as a way that stories just get passed down the line. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what I do in my classes. I teach classes on music and social protest. And so we're looking kind of what are the songs, what are they designed to do? Are they designed to generate or raise consciousness? Are they trying to sustain morale? And you can hear that in the different types of songs, the different types of music that are used in the wide variety of what's considered folk music.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. So in your bio, it says that you take a place-based approach to labor history. What does that mean, and why is a place-based approach important?
Sure. So, what I mean by place-based history is that it's rooting our understanding, or like the research and understanding of history in places. And so you look at kind of how does a place shape the historical narrative, essentially, or the history that happened there. So, for instance, like in West Virginia, if you're talking about the mine wars, well, there were mine wars in Colorado, there were mine wars in Pennsylvania, but what was unique about West Virginia that really shaped the history of the mine wars there? So looking at geography, climate, all of these things when you're talking kind of more about a larger region. And then you can take it like on a much more narrow emphasis. If you're looking at kind of a particular strike, for instance, let's say a strike at a factory, how did workers use the design of the factory in order to kind of facilitate their activism? How did the company owners use architecture and building design to try to stop workers from organizing? So really looking at how historical actors interact with the places they come from and places where they are, and how that those places shape history. So kind of looking at that kind of back and forth. So it's tied to social history, it's tied to cultural history, but again, it's very much rooted in kind of where history happened and why it happened in a particular way in a particular place. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Um, so we're talking about the importance of place, and um, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like where you grew up and how growing up has led you to your interest in labor history.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Pete Seeger country. I grew up in upstate New York on the Hudson River. And so like just a couple towns north from where Pete Seeger lived. So I grew up going to like his Clearwater Festival and stuff like that. So that's another, I feel like it's kind of like deeply ingrained in me, that just kind of was like when I got to college and then grad school, then I'm like, yes, Pete Seeger. And it was like always there. It's in the water. Um, so uh, so that's where, yeah, and that's kind of growing up with that tradition, essentially, the and this kind of cultural tied to Pete Seeger. And my interest in folk music actually really started in late high school, because I worked at a record store that was primarily classical music. And I was like the only record store in my very small town. And but they had a display of the Smithsonian Anthology of American Folk Music, and it was the first time it was released on CD in 1997. I'm showing my age, explaining that, but it was released on CD for the first time. And I was like, oh, what is this? And it was an issue of a collection that was issued on Folkways Records that came out in 1952, that were all recordings of the late 20s, early 30s that were collected. But it was all like a lot of rural music. It had, a lot of rural blues and Cajun music, shape note singing, all of this kind of what we think of as Americana. And this is one of those things, when this was released in 1952, that historians trace as one of the founding documents of the surge of popular interest in folk music and the folk music revival of the 1960s. And this blew me away the same way it blew away like high school and college students in the early 50s. And I loved it. So that was something that like Rose, I'm like, this is what I want to study. I want to get like, why is this music being produced? Looking at the different regional variations and the like. So that's, even it's not really tied to upstate New York, but that was just kind of like a pivotal thing for me. And my interest in labor history, really comes from just, I'm fascinated by the way people fought back under, facing incredibly oppressive conditions. And labor history intersects with every aspect of American history, women's and gender history, African American civil rights history. There are all these ways that intersect with the labor movement. So that's the thing that why I think labor history is so critically important to American history. It is American history. So being interested in American history really kind of, you can't escape labor history. And so that's kind of where I developed that particular interest. And I was especially interested in grad school in Southern labor history. So that's why I went to grad school in Nashville and really kind of wanted to you know, be in the place. I didn't want to study, Southern labor history, like still in New York, so yeah, that's kind of my backstory.
Yeah, that's super cool. So you've always had an interest in folk music, and then it sounds like labor history a little bit later. Do you remember when you first learned about the mine wars? Like, what was your reaction to that? Do you remember when you came across it?
Yeah, it was seeing the movie Matewan in high school, and it became like my favorite movie. And full disclosure, I still have a crush on Chris Cooper from that. But no, I absolutely love that movie. And I've found a way to work it into pretty much every class that I've taught. So that's how I first learned of it. And yeah, so I got, and then kind of getting into more of the historical thick of things. But it is really interesting how much Sales managed to capture. I mean, he did his homework, even though obviously there is a lens to it, and the main character is kind of like a hodgepodge of different ones. But it's interesting to see how other characters, like the few character of Few Clothes, how he actually was from the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike of 1913. So it's like there's so much there that once you like really get into it, you find out more and more, and can dig deeper. But that's how I first found out, and kind of carried that throughout grad school. That's why I
Yeah.
was so excited to work on this project.
I love that you mentioned Chris Cooper too, because he is also another Mine Wars Forum guest. He joined us for the first season, and it was really cool to have him on. And I think your experiences uh, relatable to a lot of other folks. They learned about it through Mate One, and then recently I hear a lot of visitors say they learned about it through the recent PBS documentary that came out just a couple of years ago, and they're like, this history is so cool, and they go down all these rabbit holes, because it's a long and complicated and complex story. I'm still trying to figure out like how to shorten it down to 200 words or whatever.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the thing with the nomination for the courthouse for when writing a National Historic Landmark nomination, you have kind of like the period of significance. So what's the time period that you're really focusing on? So the period of significance really was the trials. That's what made this courthouse important, were the period of those trials. But I was like, we have to extend it all the way back, to 1912, and then of course when I'm writing it, I'm like, well, you really have to go back to 1895 you get to like some of the first strikes and wildcat strikes in the area. So you constantly are going back, but yeah, it is such a complex story that I agree with you. It's hard to get it down.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the nomination for the courthouse. Um, what's involved with the nomination? Like, could you walk me through like how you got involved with the nomination, and then what does that process look like on the back end?
Sure. Well, and this is actually really exciting to talk about this now, because the labor history theme study is about to come out through the Park Service. So this is how, if you have a property that you're interested in designating as a National Historic Landmark, basically you write a letter of inquiry, and the letter of inquiry is just to say, this important history happened at this site, and there's certain criteria that you have to meet, but they're like, for instance, you could have like it's associated with an important person, or it's associated with an important event, like something important happened there, or some important architect designed it, or it's important for archaeology. So there are all these different criteria. So you have to kind of identify what's the important thing or aspect about a particular site or a property. And it helps. What the Park Service has done has issued a series of theme studies, and theme studies are on different topics. So you have a civil rights theme study, you have a recent one on LGBTQ history, one on American Latino history, and so there are all of these historical essays that historians write. So if you're like, hey, I have a property that's important with some aspect of history, you could go to one of these theme studies and be like, hey, this event is mentioned in this theme study that the Park Service released. So you recognize that it's important too. And so you kind of put that all in the letter of inquiry. And then the Park Service staff reviews it and they're like, okay, yeah, you got something here. So the next step would be to research and write a nomination. Um, I was brought on to the Jefferson County Courthouse because the Jefferson County Historical Commission wrote a letter of inquiry. And they originally wrote the letter of inquiry not about the mine wars, interestingly enough. This was the same site as the trials of the treason trial of John Brown after his raid on Harper's Ferry. And they're like, this is really important for US history. But the catch is, well, it's not really a catch, but not only does something important have to, there's some kind of historical, a site have to have historical significance, but it also has to have integrity. Integrity means, does it look like how it did during its historical period that you're nominating it for? Does it, have the same kind of feel, the same kind of workmanship, materials that are the same? Like basically, does it look like it did then? And unfortunately for the courthouse, it was heavily damaged during the Civil War. So its integrity as relating to the John Brown trials wasn't there because the courthouse was rebuilt. But the Park Service historians were like, well, wait a minute. There were other treason trials that took place here, and these for the people who participated in the Battle of Blair Mountain and the March on Logan. So they're like, okay, so it's not necessarily what you wanted to nominate it for, historical commission. You wanted it for John Brown, but this other history is just as important. And because I had worked on the labor history theme study, I was invited to write the nomination, research and write the nomination. So that's how I was brought on.
Cool. Yeah, it's always striking to me that there's only been a handful of treason trials in the history of the United States, and two of them took place in West Virginia and also took place in the same courthouse, which is just, really cool.
Yeah.
How long does it take from the letter of inquiry to actually getting the nomination or getting on the register? How long is that process?
It depends. It depends on how involved a nomination is, how complex a site is, because it goes through several stages. You have the actual research and writing of a nomination. This one took about a year and a half, because it goes back and forth to the Park Service historians, and they give comments, and so we have to kind of incorporate those comments in and come up with a revised draft. And then that goes before the National Historic Landmarks Commission, and they give verbal comments that we kind of record and address those. And so the final nomination, which is available online, was just released this late January, early February. So all told, about 2 years. But those, if you're nominating a historic district, like Matewan is a part of, you have on the National Register as a historic district, that's going to be more, especially if you're a National Historic Landmark, as a district. And there are, so you have the National Register, and then you have National Historic Landmarks, and they're a slightly different process. Landmarks are a bit more involved, but to become a landmark, it's not necessary, but it really, really helps if you're on the National Register already. So there's something like 90,000 plus properties on the National Register of Historic Places, and there are just shy of 3,000 National Historic Landmarks. I think it was like 2,700 the last time I checked. So that kind of shows that to become a National Historic Landmark, it's a lot more involved.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I did not know that. So we've been dancing around the Treason Trials for a little bit, and we may have some folks on here that are newcomers to this history. Could you tell us what were the Treason Trials?
Sure. So, okay, again, I'm try to give a little bit of backstory of the Mine Wars and see kind of where we go. Now, try not to take up too much time.
Take your time. Take your time.
Oh, thank you. So the Mine Wars themselves were basically from 1912 to 1921, and they're a series of strikes that faced where workers were trying to unionize with the United Mine Workers, and they faced really harsh reprisals from the coal operators. And not only were the coal operators really cracking down hard on them, but they also had the problem of the state. And the state often acting as a way, like basically kind of giving up some of its responsibilities to the coal operators, or issuing decisions in favor of the coal operators at the expense of striking miners. And this happened basically for every major strike from 1912. There's from 1912 to 1913 was the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, and that was unprecedented in its violence. It was also unprecedented in the kind of crackdown that the state issued on the in the strike zone, but purely against the miners. So, for instance, the state basically held military tribunals, even though the civil courts were like, basically they shut down the civil courts. Like, we're going to ignore them, and we're going to have these state military tribunals, which really was harsh for the miners. And that happened again when there was another major strike in 1920 in Mingo County. So anyway, those are kind of the two kind of heightened periods of activity. It was 1912 to 1913, and then immediately after World War I. So we have 1920 to 1921 with the strike in Mingo. During the strike in Mingo, you have the state again issues injunctions preventing the union from operating in the strike zone. You also have kind of, again, the miners who are on strike were forced to basically had to again go on these kind of like trumped up trials. They were held in jail in Mingo, and a lot of their civil liberties were being denied to them during the strike. And they couldn't do anything about it, essentially, because the state officials, particularly the governor, was going kind of hand in hand with the coal operators. While this is all happening, there is a sheriff, Don Chafin, who is the sheriff of Logan County, right? I feel like I'm double check me on that.
Logan, the town.
It was okay. I was like, I was 99% sure, but I'm like, I just want to make sure. Who was on the payroll, he's a sheriff, but he's also on the payroll of the coal operators. So basically, he's there to protect the coal operators' interests. So he is seen by the miners, as especially the unionizing miners, as kind of like the villain, essentially, in this. So we have this sheriff who is really just protecting miners' interests. We have a governor issuing seeking courts to issue injunctions preventing the union from operating in the strike zone. And so they had no course for protest, essentially. And that August of 1921, the miners issued a series of demands, basically demanding, that the miners being held in Mingo be released. We have in the midst of all of this the Matewan massacre. And the fact that the two Baldwin Felts detectives or guards were out on bail while this is happening, and the governor wouldn't even comment on the murders of Hatfield and Chapers. So they have all these problems, and the government would not listen. So this is what prompted the march to Mingo, essentially. And along the way, they would try to get Chafin out of Logan County. And
real quick, I misspoke. Yeah. So Don Chafin was sheriff of Logan County. So Yep.
No, yeah, thank you. I thought that was what you said. I'm sorry. So then free the miners who were in jail in Mingo. And it was there that you have, while they're encamped on the Blair Mountain, which is kind of right before you get into Logan County. There was a skirmish between Don Chapin's army and the miners' army. And it started with the killing of John Gore, who was a mine guard for Don Chapin's army. And so this precipitated 3 days of fighting. Don Chapin's army had planes where they dropped bombs onto the miners. They're dropping bombs onto civilians. And so this was, while this was going on, eventually the US government steps in, the military gets involved, troops are dispatched, and the miners lay down their arms. And they actually, glad that the government got involved, because they're like, we're not in rebellion against the federal government or against the corruption of the state government, and again, the power that the coal operators have. So this all happened and so most of the histories of the mine wars are just like the end, the laying down of arms, like that's it. But during that winter, the governor had sought the federal government to press charges of treason against the miners who had precipitated in the Battle of Blair Mountain. But the government didn't do so. In fact, the government were having Senate investigations into the coal operators and the state's treatment of miners during this. And they're like, no, we're going to keep our investigation into what's going on down there, and we're not going to issue these treason charges. So the state did it themselves. And there were over 500 indictments went out for people who had participated in the Battle of Blair Mountain. So that's what the treason trials were coming from. The state, the financing of the trials, particularly the prosecution, came from the coal operators. It didn't come from the state. So once again, you have a situation of the state basically giving up its power to the coal operators. So in order to try to access a fair trial, the trials were moved out of the kind of coal area and into Jefferson County, which is the more kind of eastern agrarian area. And so the first trial happened in actually it's April through May, and that was of Bill Blizzard. And Bill Blizzard was kind of seen as one of the leaders of the march. And what makes this so important, these trials, is that it's not just about West Virginia. It wasn't even just about the mine wars, but this got national media attention across the board. The New York newspapers like the New York Times had reporters down here. Articles about the trials were syndicated around the country. All over. This coverage was especially heavy in coal areas, like in Scranton, Pennsylvania. You had a lot of coverage there, but also a lot of coverage in New York, and like New York City, because the fear was if the miners were found guilty of treason, and this was such a flimsy charge, and I'll get into that in a second. If they were found guilty of treason, then what would this do to the labor movement? Would this mean that, anti-labor, labor organizing, heads of businesses, corporations, would they use similar tactics? Would this spread beyond West Virginia? And the whole thing was, again, the miners were just like, we are not, committing treason because the state had given up its role. And besides, the state they weren't battling the state. They were battling Don Chapin's home guard. So you have Don Chapin's army, you have his army. Where was the state? Where they weren't fighting against like state troopers or state militia or anything like that. So the charges of treason were really flimsy. And everyone agreed on that. The indictments, though, weren't just about treason. They're also treason and murder. So the first trial was that of Bill Blizzard, and the question was of treason. And so the judge, interestingly enough, was kind of not necessarily on his side, but did instruct the jury he had to have been there, and you had to have seen him, basically be on this march. And there's a conflicting testimony. And so he was found on May 25th, found not guilty of treason. And so this was everyone celebrated. Well, not everyone, but his supporters celebrated. But this wasn't the end of the legal woes. The next trials were of a father and son who were brought on the charges of killing John Gore, the mine guard, and they were found guilty that summer. And then you had the trial of Keeney, who was the leader of District 17. And he was very clear in the fact that he was not there. And this is actually really interesting because he gave a talk after the miners had gathered in Marmot before their march to Logan, saying to the New York Times, "I wash my hands of the whole affair." Did he? Probably not. But doing that, he really kind of, again, made it so that he could not be charged. Particularly if, definitely could be charged with treason, but probably wasn't thinking that was even going to be an option. But anyway, so then he was brought on trial. But oh no, I'm sorry, I missed somebody in between. In between, you had the trial of Walter Allen, and Walter Allen was the head of the Dry Branch UMW, and he was charged with treason as well. And the judge did kind of like a turnabout, and he instructed the jury that you just needed two witnesses to show that he was there and he could be held guilty of treason. And so contemporary observers were just like, whoa, this is it really, again, flimsy evidence that would be required for charging this man with treason. But so some saw the judge as basically sealing his fate. And so he was found guilty of treason, but while he was out on bail, he skipped bail, and no one ever heard from him again. So he disappeared. And to this day, I don't know if anybody knows what happened to him. This was good for him, but the UMW lost. You had to forfeit his bail, and this led to was one of the things that directly led to them going bankrupt. In the aftermath of the trials. I'm kind of getting ahead. So anyway, so then there were other trials. The jury pool got with all the media and propaganda on both sides, the trials had to be moved to two different courthouses. The Keeney trial and then the subsequent Bill Blizzard trial, and they were found not guilty in all of them, and the state just kind of dropped all charges. So no one was actually, found guilty except for the two people who were charged with murder of John Gore. They were the only ones who served jail time, but they were paroled in 25. But so in some ways this was a win, but in other ways, I mean, the trials just devastated District 17. And as I said, the legal fees and the like forced them to declare bankruptcy. And then the local had to go into receivership. So, and the leaders gave up their positions. So in one way it was like, okay, the worst didn't happen. These workers were not actually found guilty of treason. But again, as I said, it was a major blow, and it was a hard time for the labor movement in general. So this was especially hard in West Virginia during the 20s.
Yeah. So what was the aftermath like for the treason trials?
As far as I could tell, there's not a whole lot. The media attention was especially strong around Blizzard's trial. And then it kind of, after his acquittal, they kind of dissipated a little bit, except more local papers from Virginia and Maryland were covering the subsequent trials. And it's actually interesting. One of the writers was James M. Cain, who wrote The Postman Always Rings Twice. Anyway, he became a famous novelist. He was the one who wrote just a scathing portrayal of the judge who during Walter Allen's trial. So there wasn't really a whole lot. The aftermath really was just the bankrupting of District 17, and the fact that they kind of went into a period of just a really tough time until the surge of labor activism during the New Deal era. But the 20s were bad across the board, and the economy, the jobs were in pretty dire straits at that time. So it was bad for labor activism, but it was also bad just kind of economically speaking for miners. The 20s was not a good decade.
Thanks for giving us that overview. I feel like I have so much room to learn when it comes to the treason trials. And so I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge. I wonder, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask if I could share one kind of epilogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so going back to the strike in Mingo. Oh, and that was the other thing that, the strike was basically Keeney had to call off the strike because without funds, they couldn't sustain it. So that strike was a failed strike. But anyway, so back in the early days, the coal operators sought an injunction. Basically, an injunction is a court order saying you can or cannot do something. And so they had issued trying to get an injunction against the UMW from operating. And the Red Jacket mine was particularly bad. The owner of it during the strike, but one of the things that actually led to the strike was he tried to force the miners to sign what were called yellow dog contracts. And yellow dog contracts are basically saying that you agree not to join a union. And so this is something that, of course, that unions and people trying to organize fight all the time and during this period. But anyway, so there was the operators sought this injunction preventing the UMW from operating the strike zone, and it was granted by a U.S. district judge, and his name was John Parker. So fast forward, it was the United Mine Workers versus the Red Jacket. I forget the full name of the court case, but it's known as the Red Jacket injunction. Is kind of what it. And the injunction was only a small part of the decision, but it was something that again had profound consequences. Fast forward to 1930, President Hoover has to fill a Supreme Court vacancy. And he nominates John Parker to fill as his nominee for the Supreme Court. Well, pro-labor people in Congress and labor activists flipped out over this, all because of this injunction that he issued. And through their concerted effort, they prevented him from getting the nomination to the Supreme Court. So yeah, so that's kind of an epilogue to this.
That's cool. I did not know about John Parker. Interesting. So going back to the Jefferson County Courthouse, could you tell us a little bit about the courthouse, like as a building and as a place, like where it's located downtown, for those of us who have never been to Charlestown?
Sure. It's a really pretty building, red brick building. It's right in the center of town. There used to be a jail behind it, but there's not anymore. And you can't miss it. You have like kind of like a main street situation, and it's right on the main street. And the courthouse. So one of the things that we had to do with the nomination was look at the courtroom itself, where the trials took place. And the courtroom is almost exactly the same. In fact, you could see in historical pictures. Sorry, I should have brought some to share on my screen, but there's a massive chandelier, and that's featured prominently in the historical pictures of the trial, and that's still there. And so you have kind of a balcony where you have a seating area where spectators essentially can watch the proceedings, and then you have the two tables for the prosecution and defense. And it's actually interesting because if you look at pictures of the trials, the defense table is packed. And one of the people there was John Lewis, who was the head of the United Mine Workers. And the courtroom itself is packed. But otherwise, it's kind of like a typical traditional kind of courtroom. It's really the chandelier that makes it stand out. But yeah, there's architectural historians could tell you a little bit more about the design of it, and kind of where it fits in the architecture of courthouses. I mean, it's not like a really stately one. Like I think the McDowell County Courthouse is really pretty. It's not as pretty as that. I'm going to be honest, but no, it is an attractive building.
Cool. Cool. I want to invite anybody who's watching, if you have questions for Dr. Donaldson, please drop them in the comments and we'll get to them before we hop off. Rachel, is there anything else that you want to talk about tonight that we didn't get to, either about the Treason Trials or folk music or labor history in general?
Yeah, well, one interesting thing again, where you could see that where these two intersect, if I was going to say like the labor anthem out of for the 20th century labor movement in the U.S., it's "Solidarity Forever," and "Solidarity Forever" was written by Ralph Chapman, who was a kind of a member of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and he was inspired to write this. He wrote it in 1950 after seeing the solidarity of the miners in the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike. So this strike, again, in really kind of limited to West Virginia, becomes part of the national narrative because of this song that we hear like anytime there's a strike. It's such an important part of American labor history, and so it was inspired by those events. So that's another kind of, I think, takeaway from the mine wars.
Yeah, that's really cool. Someone had dropped in the comments that they knew Florence Reese, who wrote "Which Side Are You On?" I wonder if Rachel is familiar with her.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's moving across the state line to Kentucky, is when she wrote that during another kind of bloody strike. But absolutely. And did she just like, I mean, I don't know if this is like a kind of lore now, but she just kind of grabbed a piece of paper and wrote it down on the fly while it was happening. But yeah, another major song, not just though for the labor movement. That's one of these songs that have moved also to the civil rights movement. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, is how songs move from one movement to another. A lot of labor songs showing up for the civil rights movement. I could go off on that for a minute, but I want to see if anybody else has questions first before I do.
I've heard that legend too about that song, that it was just scribbled out. So we've got one here from Steve Watkins. Where did they play baseball during the treason trial? And did the judge identify and set bail for some of the defendants based on the position they played in the baseball games during the trials? I love this question.
So yes, they did play. They were invited. They were the away team. Bill Blizzard was on the team, and it was interesting. It was all the defendants who were invited to play in this baseball game. Nobody in the prosecution. I did not come across thinking about anything about the judge identifying and setting bail based on the position, but I'd be really curious to know where you heard that, because yeah, I didn't come across in my resources, but I'm not going to say that it didn't happen. I just didn't come across it.
Cool.
That's really neat.
Were these like all the injunctions operators were getting against Mother Jones to keep her from talking?
So yes, exactly. So Mother Jones, because she was an organizer with the United Mine Workers, she would be prevented from talking as well. The injunction covered anybody associated with the UMW. So one of the things about, particularly if you think about like company towns, coal operators controlled everything except for railroad beds and waterways. So sometimes there's a story of Mother Jones going out and speaking in a creek, because that was property that was not owned, or controlled at least by the coal operators. But yeah, so she was held in a makeshift jail for speaking during the mine wars, and in opposition, or in defiance essentially to one of these injunctions. So yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, and that's another place, the house where she was held has since been torn down. So that's a big shame. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we were the National Coal Heritage Area Authority was able to get a Legends and War marker up in Pratt where she was held. I think it's right across the street or close by to where she was jailed. So at least there's something there now, that marks that.
That's great.
From Doug, do you recall where James Cain's article on the trials was published?
I have to double check my resources. I know that he was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun at this time, and I think it was in the Baltimore Sun. But that's a good question, and I don't know definitively, but I can look it up. But I would check that, and you can find those like on newspapers.com if you kind of look him up there. But I believe it was for the Baltimore Sun. But I'll double check. Good question.
Cool. I think that's all the questions that we have. Is there anything else you want to offer? Any closing words before we go?
Sure. So what I was saying about like the kind of going back to folk music and tying things from labor movement to civil rights, the NHL, the National Historic Landmark nomination I'm working on right now is for a factory in Charleston, the other Charleston, in South Carolina, where there was a strike from 1945 to 1946, led by Black women, cigar workers. And one of the things that makes this, there are several reasons why this is important. But one of the things, again, relates to music because the strikers, to sustain morale on the strike, would close each day of picketing. And this was a wet, cold winter. And they were on the picket lines every day for this. They would sing the song, All Over Come Someday. And this was a song that was commonly sung by African-American strikers in the South during the early 20th century. And they changed it, the lyrics All Over Come Someday, to suit the kind of collective action of the strike to will overcome, we will overcome. And after the strike was over, they, some strike veterans went to workshops, labor workshops at the labor school, Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee. And there they taught it to the music director, Sophia Horton. And she taught it to Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger and others, he's really responsible for changing the we to shall. And this is where you get we shall overcome. And activists came to, when Highlander Folk School kind of switched from being a labor school to really facilitating the civil rights movement, they would sing "We Shall Overcome" at workshops on teaching people how to engage in integration, essentially in the early 50s. And that's how the song moved into civil rights activism. We know it as a civil rights song, but really it first began as a labor song. Actually, it first began as like a commercial song, but it really became popular because of its use in labor activism.
That's super cool. And I love how full circle that is for when we were talking about Pete Seeger. You were talking about Pete Seeger at the beginning and then now in your current work. That's awesome. Well, I want to say thank you so much. This has been so much fun. I'm glad that we were able to finally have an episode on the Treason Trials, and it's been a really incredible episode. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining us. For those who are watching, leave us some feedback. So we are going to drop in a short feedback form in the comments and let us know what you liked, what kind of programming and guests you'd like to see in the future. We'll drop that link in the comments now. And with that said, we've got one episode left of Mind Wars Forum. Please make plans to join us for our final episode in exactly 2 weeks, where we'll sit down with Lonnie Lee Hood, who you might know as Abby Lee Hood, for a conversation about journalism and writing for the working class. So before we say goodnight, I've got just a couple announcements and invitations for folks. The first is make the trip to Make One. So the museum is officially open for the season. This is our 8th season, I believe, and we're open Thursdays through Saturdays, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we're also available for any kind of special tours. We love to host classrooms, church groups, individuals. If you're interested in that, you can visit our website or shoot us an email. Secondly, is to attend the Treason Trials Centennial this year. So our friend Dougie Steph, who I know is watching tonight, is really working hard and pulling together some amazing programming for the Treason Trials Centennial. A schedule of events will be released publicly soon, but I got the go-ahead to share some activities that are going to happen a little bit later this month and also next month. So on April 22nd at 7 p.m., there's going to be a screening of the movie Mate One, which is something that we talked about tonight at Shepherd University. On April 30th at 7 p.m., there's going to be a panel discussion with leading authors and historians of the mine wars, also going to be happening at Shepherd University with Dr. Chuck Keeney, Denise Giardina, Doug Estep, and more. On May 6th at 7 p.m., there's going to be a movie screening of The Mine Wars, another movie that we talked about tonight that came up in our programming, which will be at Shepherd University. And then on May 13th, there's going to be grand finales. You'll get to actually tour the trial courtroom. So we were talking a lot about the Jefferson County Courthouse tonight. This is your chance to go and get a look inside and actually be in the place where this monumental history occurred. And then also on that same evening, there's going to be live music featuring miners and workers' rights songs. There's going to be performances by Tom Briding, Mary Hott with the Carpenter Ants, and some special guests. So there's going to be some incredible programming that's coming out and will be in Jefferson County later this month and early next month. So please make plans to join our friends up there. And then the final invitation is to support the work of the museum by becoming a monthly member. So with your membership, we can continue to tell this proud history through our exhibits, events, and programs like this forum. You can sign up for only $10 a month, and a little bit goes a long way in helping us sustain this history and preserve it for future generations. I'll say thank you again to Rachel and all of those that watched with us. We will see you next time for our final episode of Season 3 on April 26th. Good night, everybody.